Our speaker this evening is David Kinley, who's enjoying himself with a nice drink. I hope he is anyways. Professor of Human Rights Law, Sydney University. He is the author of Necessary Evil, How to Fix Finance by Saving Human Rights. David is an expert member of the, I hope I pronounced this correctly, David, Doherty Street Chambers in London. He is a former Fulbright senior scholar. That's the American Fulbright, right?
Yeah.
Good man. At American University. I always wanted to ask that question. He's at Washington College. He's spoken at the Washington College of Law, a Herbert Smith visitor at Cambridge University, and a visiting fellow at the Max Planck Institute in Luxembourg. He has also held a visiting research position at the Vietnamese Institute for Human Rights in the Ho Chi Minh Political Academy, which is in Hanoi, and has taught at the Australian National University, the Chinese Academy of New South Wales, of Social Sciences in Beijing, Kathmandu School of Law, and the University of New South Wales, the University of Pretoria, the Sorbonne, and the University of South Pacific Vanuatu. He has also been on the faculty of Oxford, George Washington University's International Human Rights Summer School for many years.
Thanks very much for inviting me. It's very kind of you, and indeed for one of my students, Jenny, who's going to do the clicking as we move through the slides. So hopefully we can communicate with each other. So this is the cover of the book. There's a few copies of it behind me here. But if we think of what finance and human rights are, they really are this. They are strange bedfellows. So what on earth have they got in common? And in fact, what I'm going to do tonight is just to ask three questions. What is the relationship between them? Why should we care? And then what can we do about making the relationship better? So, first of these, what is the relationship between finance and human rights? These are we could go through all of these. These are the sorts of things that you find in international law and domestic law that talk about human rights. You have laws, you have at the international level, and you have domestic laws. I wouldn't spend any time on this other than to say what I think is important about human rights, and as we get into this talk, I want you to bear this in mind, is that it doesn't have to be human rights laws. Criminal law, labour law, privacy, even tort law, the idea that you owe a duty to your neighbour, that you are not negligent in the actions as a profession, and when you give advice, those sorts of things are human rights laws as much as anti-discrimination laws or the Australian Human Rights Commission. There are also soft laws as well, these sorts of guidelines that exist at the international level. But then finally, there is the spirit of human rights. Now, I think this is very important. Now, I'm a human rights lawyer, so obviously I spend a lot of time looking at law. But what I think is most interesting about the spirit of human rights is this notion of what we as a community expect from each other. And I've been very sort of pleased by the fact that this Royal Commission into Banking and Finance has occurred at the same time as the book has come out, because the Commissioner, Kenneth Hayne, who is a former High Court judge, has talked about community expectations as being a key feature of what we expect from our banks. Not just laws, but community expectations. Now, I think human rights in this everyday sense, this community expectations, aren't necessarily about what we see in laws. They are vanilla. They're the ordinary things that we try and achieve in our daily lives. And I would suggest they are the following things. When you think of what human rights are, what you want from your life, you want safety and security, you want health and welfare, you want respect and dignity, what you expect from others and what you expect to be given to yourself. And finally, freedom and learning. All of those things, I think, are a better way of understanding what human rights is about, rather than focusing on the law. To you, me, and to financiers, to bankers, you look at these sorts of things, you think, yeah, that's what human rights are about. Now, I would suggest that you've got very similar views about what everyday finance is about. Everyday finance is also ice cream, but of course it's chocolate because it's richer. But it is the same things. It's safety, security, health and welfare, respect. Because when you earn money, when you seek finance, when you obtain finance, what are you using it for? You don't do it just because you want more money in your bank. You want these sorts of things, do you not? You want safety and security for yourself and your family and your community. You want to be healthy and you want welfare. You want to be treated with respect and dignity, and money helps in that regard, and it also helps you to have freedom and to learn. So I would say there is an immediate congruity, an immediate link between finance on the one hand and human rights on the other, in this everyday sense. Finance has done lots of really good things. I'm going to come to the bad as well, but it's done lots of really good things. Now, this looks rather complicated, but it's not. All I'm trying to show in these graphs, or somebody else has put these graphs together, but what I'm trying to show is that we've moved enormously over the last 200 years. These graphs are from 1820 to today. Now, look at extreme poverty. But extreme poverty back in 1820, which is way over on the left, nearly 90% of the world lived in extreme poverty. So they weren't able to feed themselves properly, right up until the war. Where it starts to go downwards, it's the Second World War. So we've lived in poverty for a hell of a long time, most of us. But now we're right down to less than 10% of the world's population lives in really abject poverty. That's still a lot of people. That's still about 700 million people. But it is better than where it was. Our basic education and literacy, the next two graphs, have risen. And again, they've risen largely when it comes to welfare state, better education for everyone, the Second World War. Vaccination and child mortality, a little later, 1960s, when we've got enough money to vaccinate our kids, and our kids are surviving longer. That top right hand is democracy, which is a bit all over the place, as you can see. That dip down there, right in the middle, is the war. And then we've risen, more countries are living in democracy now than they used to, but it's a bit of a hairy ride, as we know, right at the moment. This is another interesting thing. Please don't be bamboozled by the sort of graphs. It's a simple idea. This black line at the bottom is aid. So that's aid that rich countries like Australia, the United Kingdom, the United States, they give to poor countries, or they loan to poor countries. Now the important thing about this graph is that in 1990, these are poor countries. In 1990, most of the money coming into poor countries was aid, the black line. Do you see that at the bottom, at the left-hand side? But look what's happened. Aid has pretty much flatlined. So the aid we give from the United Kingdom, from Australia, from the US, has really not changed at all. What has changed is that the money coming into poor countries has been private sector money. FDI is corporations investing in poor countries. So they've now invested up to 8 times what aid is. Remittances is where people go overseas, like Nepalese go overseas to work in Arab countries, building, for instance, like the 2020 soccer stadium for Qatar, and send money back to their families at home. That's what remittances are. That's huge now because so many people work overseas. And the green line is about poor countries owning shares, individuals owning shares. In poor countries now, people do own shares. They used to own none. But in just 30 years, they now have a considerable income. So the point in all of this is that finance, private sector finance, has had a real impact on what developing countries do, not just aid. Not all that impact is good, though. There are benefits, we can go through all of this, yeah. There are benefits like financial access. More people have access to finance now, even in poor countries, they can tap and go. Social housing is now something that the private sector is investing in. Why? Because it can make a buck out of it. But there's also dangerous finance, problems with finance. Where's greed? The idea that an awful lot of finance at the moment is what one former banker called socially useless. That is, it's involved in making money from money rather than investing in things that make something other than money, like normal industry. There's also, of course, the huge problem of corruption. Money laundering is a massive issue for the West. That we launder a lot of money in the West, in countries like Australia. Money comes in, is laundered here, and then, even if it's inadvertent, by our banks, and then it's squeaky clean. This is how much money is flowing around the world that is illicit. In other words, illegal money. It's money that has flowed in or out of poor countries. Now, the point of the graph is that this left-hand column is percentage. So percentage of the world's GDP, so the amount of money flowing around the world, about 25% of it is illicit. That means people avoiding paying their tax, corporations avoiding paying the tax, or it's simply been stolen by the Sahatos of the world in Indonesia, or by oil barons who don't pay their taxes. Why should we care about finance and human rights, though? 3 reasons, I would say. The first of these is it makes business sense. Here's 3 people, you can go all the way through, Jenny. 3 people that talk about business sense. Warren Buffett, who is the first of those, talks about making value, not just taking value. So he's an uber investor, and he believes that you've got to invest in corporations that make value rather than just take it. I don't know if any of you have read Nassim Taleb, but he talks about having skin in the game. That means if you invest in something that you are going to suffer from, rather than other people paying you to get out of the problems, like with the global financial crisis, you will act differently. You will be more careful about the risks that you take. And then finally, this is important. This is Larry Fink, who, if you go over, talks about a social license to profit. Now, Larry Fink is really an interesting individual. He is the CEO of the biggest financial firm on earth. Their assets are 6 trillion. It's almost difficult to understand how big that is. But BlackRock is an investor. It holds assets. It's equivalent to 8% of the New York Stock Exchange. So he's a really major investor, just this one company. And there are 2 others that are beneath him, which together, the 3 of them, make up about 16% of the New York Stock Exchange. So they're huge. So when they say something, it's worth listening to. And this is what Fink said in a letter to the sort of companies he invests in earlier this year. He said that society demands that companies serve a social purpose. They must contribute to society. Now, let's be clear that he still wants to make a profit. He's investing to make a profit. But he wants those companies that he invests in to do so in a way that benefits society as well as him. That's the difference. So there is some hope, even from somebody like Larry Fink, particularly from somebody like Larry Fink, in the way things are moving. It's also politically prudent. This first graph, so it's the reason why you should care. This first graph shows the difference between the rich and the poor in Europe. So the blue line at the top is how much the lowest 50% in Europe own in terms of wealth of Europe as a whole. It's about 20%, 24% is all on the left. So 50% on the bottom 50% of Europeans own about 24% of the wealth of Europe. So it's not fair, as it were. This line is 1%. So the top 1% in Europe, they own about 12 or 14%. So 1% own. So there's a real difference there, and it's clearly unfair in terms of what the Europeans, the top Europeans, own compared to the bottom Europeans. But then that's nothing compared to the United States. This is the 1% in the United States, which reaches up now, 1% owns more than 20%. And the lowest 50% now have gone downwards, they own about 14%. So you can really see just in that one graph, and it's always dangerous to say that one graph can explain Trump, but if there is one to say that explains Trump, it is what are often called now the left behinds. The people in the United States who feel that the system over the last 30 years has failed them. They are the ones that have dropped off the edge. They're pissed off, so what do? They find a way in which to blow up the system. There's no better way to blow up the system than Trump. I'm not justifying it, I'm simply saying that is a reason. If you have been screwed over in terms of finance and the rich have got richer, even though Trump belongs to them, you can see why it's a protest vote. Australia, we're not much better. We're sort of in between Europe and the United States, which probably doesn't surprise you, does it? The top line here is the 1%, so the 1% in Australia own 20%, probably rising to 23% now. And the bottom 50% have pretty much stayed the same, about 11% down to maybe now 10%. So we're somewhere in between in terms of inequality, but it's massive inequality still. This is the Edelman Trust Barometer. So what they do is that they have a barometer, they measure people's trust, ordinary people's trust in various industries, including finance. We are the last green on the right. So less than 49% of us, 49% of us, so less than half, trust our banks. Hong Kong, United Kingdom, Argentina, Spain, and all the way back to Ireland, my own country, and not that many of yours. Ireland is right at the end. That's where untrustworthy banks are viewed. The people do not trust the bank. And I'm not going to spend time on this, but isn't it interesting that the ones who really trust their banks are the newly found riches of India, China, Indonesia, Malaysia, even Mexico? There have been a lot of bad behaviour by banks in particular. Now, I'm not going to put these up for the students as much as anything else, and I don't want to focus on them, but two things that I think are interesting from these examples, because they resonate here in Australia with the Royal Commission, which I'm coming to, by the way, is that so complacent has finance become about its capacity to be able to escape censure and to chase the dollar as if that was justified, that the Bank of America was recently, well, last year, 2017, was successfully prosecuted before the Supreme Court of the United States for having an overt discriminatory process of selling mortgages to poor communities. And that express discrimination was that it focused on Hispanic and black communities and provided them with mortgage rates higher than other poor communities. So it was based on race. And that single basis of race rather than anything else, rather than poverty, found them in transgressing a federal law. Sorry. No, it's okay. And the second case is the HSBC case, which is the very bottom one. Now this resonates, you probably don't remember because we've had so many banking scandals over the last while, but the HSBC case involved money laundering in a Mexican branch of the HSBC of drug cartels who for years, in fact for more than a decade, were pumping money through a Mexican branch of the HSBC, which is the biggest retail bank in the world. And nobody was asking questions as to where this money was coming from. So they were in effect propagating murder and drugs. And yet nobody pursued them. But they did eventually get prosecuted by the Department of Justice and had to pay a settlement fine of 1.9 billion. Australia, or the CBA, Commonwealth Bank of Australia, was not at quite the same level, but was still involved in laundering money by allowing an inadequate supervision of its deposit system. I don't even remember, you could deposit up to 10,000 without having, so everyone was depositing 9,900. And that went on for, 150,000 cases or whatever it was. It was immense. They're getting away with it as well. Now that really is the most extraordinary dimension of this, is that after the global financial crisis in the United States, they had relatively few referrals to the Department of Justice, DOJ's Department of Justice, and yet somewhat equivalent financial crisis 20 years before, they had thousands of bankers being prosecuted. What happened in between? What happened in between is that the criminal law system was changed in a way that made it more difficult to identify when bankers were actually operating criminally. There was a greater grey area. Risk was encouraged, and as a consequence of risk, they were given a longer leash in terms of criminal law. So what happened is that they had settlements. I don't know if those of you are lawyers or not, and if you're not lawyers, congratulations, but settlements mean that you don't get a prosecution, you're not convicted, but you do have to pay something for this, but you don't get a criminal record. These deferred prosecution agreements, as they're called, are now the norm rather than prosecutions. And they're huge. The amount of money that's pumped out in these is massive, and yet it isn't a deterrent. Look at the bottom line there. The Bank of America has had 34 cases in which the Department of Justice has agreed to settle for $77 billion. And that hasn't deterred them. What happened after the first one? Well, 33 more occurred. So clearly it's not a deterrent. A third reason, I think there might actually be four, but a third reason is personal ethics. Now this, I think, is a crucial part of the way we want banks to change, and I think how we might be able to change them. You want bankers and people who work in finance, I'm sure you know some. Well, I would imagine you know some. I certainly do. You'd like to think that they want to be proud of what it is that they do, that they want to be proud of when they look in the mirror, that they're happy to tell their kids what they do rather than do it, as it were, in a sly, underhand way. You want to minimize those moments when you think, really, am I doing this? But of course, some people just think it's a job. What we have now here is clearly an issue with our culture and incentives and concerns. This is Ken Hayne. And you can see in his report, I don't know if any of you have looked at his report that came out a couple of weeks ago, it's 1,000 pages long, so it's not something that you just have a flick through. But you can see Hayne is saying we're now, the financial sector is full of greed, criminality, breach of trust, dishonesty, fraud. What do we need? Now, this is a former High Court judge. He says, we need a culture of justice and fairness alongside utility and efficiency. We want them to be efficient. We want them to make a profit, but they've got to be fair. How are they fair? Well, do banks and should banks operate and fund tyrants and autocrats? This is the freedom map of the world. Purple is on free. Green is free. Yellow is somewhere in between. Now we sit in a region where there's lots of unfreedom, and yet many of our banks and indeed our businesses do business in unfree areas. This is one example. ANZ, just a couple of weeks ago, in fact 10 days ago, was investigated by the OECD processes, which one of them is based in Australia. And it was found that in its financing of a Cambodian sugar plantation, there were clear examples of forced evictions, child labour and workplace deaths. And yet the contact point, the OECD investigator said, and here's the real thing, that the ANZ has its own human rights standards, and when you looked at them, most, if not all of them, would not have been met. So it begs the question, why do they have these human rights standards, which we read, people like me read, people like my students read and say, oh yes, ANZ, and all the others have them as well, CBA, NAB, Westpac, they look good because they want to protect human rights. And yet, when something like this is so manifestly contrary to human rights, they don't fulfill their mandate. That's a real problem of culture. So what can we do about it? Well, here are some people that we can draw on. Mary Wollstonecraft. I don't know if anyone knows her. You probably do know who Mary Wollstonecraft was, but she's the first feminist, and I think actually the most important feminist human rights writer. But she's also, and you certainly will know this, she's the mother of Mary Shelley, who wrote Frankenstein. In fact, she died 10 days after she gave birth to Mary Shelley. She was the most incredible woman. She was only 36 or 38 when she died, and she wrote some of the most poignant texts on human rights from a woman's perspective. And back then in 1792, that was really something. Anyhow, she says, what we need is the same energy that renders a daring villain can also be corralled, can be massaged to help society. So there are many daring villains, I would suggest, in finance. So we need to culture them. We need to nurture them, if we can, in a way that helps society, because that energy is beneficial rather than just something that can benefit the individual. And Adam Smith, the doyen of economics, says exactly the same thing. Yes, self-interest is important, but the greater interest of others overshadows that. So you want to pursue your self-interest, but at the same time, you must do good for the rest of society. Otherwise, you don't have the social license. So what can they do all about this? Well, certainly not all bankers are wearing Birkenstocks at the weekend, or you'd like to think some of them are. But they do need more of this. They need more integrity and ethics, respect and honesty. How do we achieve this? This is the wave of socially responsible finance. Here's the wave. Is it now becoming mainstream? Well, there are some hopes here. Development banks, the aid banks are doing more in responsible finance, so are national governments, even sovereign wealth funds. These are ours is called the Future Fund. Even they are, because they're public, are investing, and some of them even divesting in coal, for instance. The Norwegian Wealth Fund, which is the biggest in the world, has pulled out of investing in coal. So they do have a social conscience. Private equity and asset holders like Larry Fink are moving in that direction. Even commercial banks, they may not be doing it right, but they're saying they are interested in human rights. And even corporations are now issuing bonds that are so-called green bonds or social bonds. But, and I'm coming to an end now, institutional problems and possibilities do exist. Here's one. This is Wall Street, of course, but it applies here, it applies in the United Kingdom, it applies actually in all capitalist economies, which means really all economies on Earth, except perhaps North Korea. And that is that the hens, us, are actually being guarded by the foxes. So Wall Street has got regulators. Australia financial sector has regulators, but who populates the regulators? They are former bankers.
That's right.
And the former bankers obviously have an interest, but they also know about the financial system, which is what we want. They want them to know about the financial system. But they do have a vested interest, and they can protect each other. It's a band of brothers and a few sisters.
Yep.
So what does Hayne, again, say about this? Well, and this is where we see this sort of fox in the henhouse problem. If you have, and I have looked through his, I've not read it all, 1,000 pages is beyond me, but I have read through a lot of it. And if you look at what misconduct has occurred in our financial sector, what has happened? Well, what has happened is we've had apologies and infringement notices rather than convictions. These, they're called enforceable undertaking and remediation programs, and the penalties that come from them are often immaterial or disproportionate. In other words, they're paying a small proportion of what might have been the consequence if they had been convicted in a criminal court. Why is ASIC not pursuing that? Well, that is a big question that Hayne is trying to reveal. And finally, there are these negotiated agreements. I mean, one of the greatest problems of ASIC, which is the Australian Securities and Investment Commission, which is supposed to be the fox that is overlooking, or the regulator that is overlooking our financial sector, is that it is so close to banks that even when they're putting out a media release to identify the wrongs that a bank has done, they're negotiating with the banker to ensure that it meets the expectations of the banker. Now, what is that about? A colleague and I, who's a financier, are doing a study on this, and in fact we put in a submission, or we're putting it in tomorrow, into the Royal Commission, which is looking at the human rights consequences of Australian banks. And we've identified 4 areas, when we've looked through all the ASIC media releases in the last 2 years, 4 areas where there are clear human rights breaches, and nobody's talking about this. Privacy and information use, anti-discrimination, violation of people's right to economic security, and finally they don't have remedies. They're standing in the way, banks are standing in the way of remedies when people's human rights are abused. So we're trying to encourage Ken Hayne to look at the human rights dimensions of financial skullduggery, not just the criminal and commercial consequences. Now here's an interesting person. You may know who this is.
Elizabeth Warren.
Yes. Elizabeth Warren is a senator of Massachusetts in the United States. She's just introduced a bill. It's called, the Americans call it an act, but it's a bill. This is not legislation, this is a proposal. It's called the Accountable Capitalism Act. And what she's saying is that all corporations should have the interests of many stakeholders, not just shareholders, in what they do. Yes, shareholders are important, but also customers and the communities in which banks operate. So she's suggesting that there should be set up a federal registry for corporations that would ensure that these other customers and communities and employees are taken notice of. Now, in the United States, this is somewhere particular of the United States. It wouldn't happen in Europe, probably not here either. She's been considered a Marxist, channeling Marxism because she's putting this up, which is the most ironic idea because she's supporting capitalism.
Right.
She's just saying that it's got to be done for the benefit of all, not just shareholders. So it is a really remarkably, if I can be so rude to say, typical American response to say that she's channeling socialism. This is the sort of stuff that is done in Europe. It's even done, at least notionally, in our Corporations Act and in the Companies Act in the UK, even if it isn't pursued with the vigour that it should be. Now, culture really matters. This is, and I am really coming to that, but this is an interesting little story. A few years ago, there was a group of, in fact, I have to have a drink of Guinness before I actually tell you.
Yay!
No fair.
A few years ago, there was a group of behavioural economists who wanted to answer the question whether finance attracts cheats or whether it creates them. And so what it did is it took 128 bankers from the same bank and it randomly split them into two groups, 64 in each. But with the first group, it prized them with questions about their home life. So, what books are you reading? What films? Who are your children? Who are you married to? What do you like pizza? What food do you like? With the other group, they primed them with questions about their work. What are your key performance indicators? What's your salary? Who are your competitors? What makes a good banker and a bad banker? So it made one group think about banking and the other group think about home. And then asked them to do exactly the same experiment. And this experiment was this, that each one of you goes away into a corner and tosses a coin 10 times, and you've got to record the results, heads or tails. If you get a head, you'll get 20 bucks. If you get a tail, you get nothing. We're not going to look at what you're doing, you just do it in private and then tell us the results. Now, of course, as you must know, if everyone was to do this, then overall, with all 128 bankers, you should get pretty much 50-50. I mean, shouldn't you? Tossing a coin. 50 heads, or whatever it is, same number of heads, same number of tails. But the two groups displayed real differences. So for the first group, the innocent bankers, so the ones thinking about pizza and their children, you got pretty much the same number of heads and tails. This, according to statisticians, is not statistically significant. 330, 310. It's pretty even. But with the bankers who were thinking about banking, there was a real difference. So you would get 20 bucks more, so they cheated. So the behavioural economists, and I am no behavioural economist nor am I a statistician, say that this is a significant statistical difference, such that you can only explain it by virtue of people's attitude. In other words, people must have cheated. Now, this is good and bad. I mean, it's bad on the one hand, isn't it, that your incentives make you cheat. But here's the good thing. Surely if it makes you cheat, then we can change the incentives to make you better. That would be the idea.
If you had asked the politicians to do that, it could be 400
well, I think the politicians would be somewhat similar, yes. But you know, it's a good...
I'm saying it would be even worse than
I mean, maybe even worse. It possibly would. But you know, there was actually a backup experiment to this in which, before they did the experiment, the behavioural economists asked a group of ordinary people, who do you think will cheat? Doctors, politicians, prisoners, or bankers? And they said, bankers. Even prisoners.
Bingo!
Yeah.
Different 60 years ago, though.
You think so? Would it be different?
Why? Why?
What would have been different 60 years ago?
Bankers were honest, decent, highly respected members of the community.
You're dead right.
Personal relationship with
I mean,
that
or
person.
at least more so. And in fact, in the book, I should say that I am. This is the reason I'm doing this, because this book, I talk about the fact that, you know, when we were, I think you and I are probably the same age, or very close to it, when we were in our 20s and 30s, banking was boring. And bankers were the pillar of society, weren't they?
Yeah.
They were the pillar of society. Now they are. We really do think they're on the nose, don't we? Yeah. Well, they make a lot of money, but we think they're on the nose. Now that, actually, I don't think that's good for banking or for us. So I agree with you. I think it could have been different. Here's a pair of interesting men, James Flynn and Steve Pinker. Now, the reason I put this is because of how we finished that last slide. James Flynn is an American who now lives in New Zealand. And he came up with this notion, this hunch, a few years ago, that it seemed that when people did IQ tests, that the 100, which is the median, was rising all the time. So in other words, we seem, as a community across many countries, to get smarter. And so you have to keep putting the 100 up higher and higher, because that's the mean. And Steve Pinker then analysed the reasons why we're getting more intelligent, it would appear. And it wasn't in rote learning, it wasn't in mathematics, it wasn't in science. Where we seem to be getting more intelligent, in inverted commas, was in terms of empathy, our understanding of culture and of others. And so Pinker, who's a philosopher, a Harvard philosopher, said, maybe what we've got then is this empathetic intelligence that we are becoming, one hopes, overall, more understanding of others rather than less. Now, I know in the current world, you may think that that's nonsense, but there are signs of good outcomes. In fact, I would suggest that one of them is Ireland. Just look what's happened in Ireland over the last 20 years in terms of the social changes. They're almost gobsmacking compared to where Ireland was 20 years ago. And that has a lot to do with, well, many things, but one of them is education and wealth. Ireland is a very different place from when I was there, being brought up there. So there are signs of perhaps banking on the fact that bankers and the rest of us can be changed. We can change attitudes within banking. It's going to be a very long, hard road, but I would like to think that people like Kenneth Hayne and what we've seen with the Royal Commission, which has been a real wake-up call, don't you think, over the last 8 months, that people have realised that banking can have a real human rights impact on individuals. Not just money and numbers, it really does hurt people, and we've seen those people paraded in front of Ken Hayne over the last 8 months. One hopes, and as a human rights lawyer you always are optimistic, you have to be, one hopes that things can change, maybe not quickly, but that they can change. And I think that's the
They may have changed back though, because that was the message of Mary Poppins.
Yes, that is true, with boring banking then. Yes, but at least we're on the change on the up rather than staying where we are. In other words, I think the lesson is that we don't have to just accept that banking needs to rip us off and that there should be such huge inequalities. And I think we're seeing these differences in politics as well as law and in finance. And they maybe are reaching breaking points, which I'm not necessarily saying is a good thing, but it might bring change that brings greater equity. So, and this is the final slide, can we be optimistic? You know, can we give money to banks that are good? I mean, a lot of them have fallen crests, but there must be some of them out there. There are some. I know some of them as well, but we need more. So there we go, that's it.
Now listen, my son works at HFTC.
All right, okay.